but we'll try and get finished by 11 o'clock with this panel. D.A. O'Malley, and very much, and thank you for being so diligent that half, so I guess on the order of 45 of the 236.1 trafficking violations came out of Alameda County, which would clearly show if the other counties were doing something similar, I would guess that there would be quite a bit more in the state.
Good morning, Assembly Member, and thank you very much for convening this hearing, and good morning to the members. I have been involved in this issue since 1994. When I had my first case, I had a grant to focus on sexual exploitation of teenagers, and the first case I had was a 12-year-old girl who was being trafficked by a 39-year-old man, and the police rescued her from the hotel room where she was being sexually abused by a 50-year-old man, and both of those individuals were prosecuted. And that started me focusing on what was going on with our children, especially around sex trafficking. We didn't quite know what it was then, but we started listening to the children that were being arrested on a routine basis for prostitution-related crimes. And we started hearing what they were telling us, that there was somebody else that was putting them on the street. Many of them did not come from, nor did they want to be doing that. And we just started growing our efforts. In 2005, I created a vertical unit for prosecution just to focus on human trafficking. And since we started that unit in 2006 of prosecuting human trafficking cases, and I'm going to focus right now on just child sex trafficking, which does have adult victims who were trafficked as children and then became adults. We're still being trafficked, not necessarily by the same individual with whom they had started that relationship. Since 2006, we have charged 467 defendants with child sex trafficking. We have already concluded 415 of those cases, which resulted in 339 convictions, and we still have 65 cases pending, and that's as of September 1. The fear that prosecutors often have is that these cases are difficult to prosecute, as Maggie Kroll said, and I agree with that. However, a lot of prosecutors, we haven't recognized it around the state, and it's been my effort for the last several years to bring that recognition to all DA offices, but also to recognize that even when you have very challenging facts, the jurors understand and listen to the evidence. And in our case, and we now believe it's more than 50% of all the cases that have been prosecuted, we have an 82% conviction rate. So we're showing other prosecutor offices and law enforcement offices that when you have a human trafficking case, these are cases that we can bring into the courtroom and we can secure convictions where the evidence supports it. We also have a big focus on labor trafficking. And so far in my office, we've now prosecuted and convicted in the civil arena labor traffickers, where we have been able to seize and forfeit their assets and then give restitution to the victims who are forced to work, either without wage or hopefully under wage paid. And many of these individuals who are victims of the labor trafficking have been immigrants, and the threat to them was, if you go tell anyone, first of all, you're not going to. Secondly, if you do, nobody's going to believe you because you're here without documentation, or because nobody cares or they're not going to believe you. So we've also been successful, and we've convened a task force, Assembly Member, in Alameda County for the labor trafficking providers and the legal aid centers where a lot of people go when they have wage theft and other things like that. With respect to, we do have good data, because as you are, I too am data driven. I want to know that what we're doing and the energy where we're putting our energies are making the difference. So we do know that so far in the county since 2011, we have worked with 529 youth. Only about 2% of those are boys, but we can't forget that boys are being sex trafficked also. They just present differently in our system. But of the 529 youth that we've identified, only 60% actually live in Alameda County. And that just reflects how mobile this crime is, where kids are coming from, being brought from LA, from the Central Valley, from Sacramento. There's a triangle that is often followed between Central Valley, Sacramento, Oakland, and back down. So we're looking at the demographics of these children to see what is it that who are they, where are they coming from, what happened to them that they are in this situation, and we're learning more about the demographics. So when we do look at policy recommendations for your legislature, we want to make sure that we're addressing issues so that we can prevent human trafficking rather than really refine our response to it. Both are important, but to the extent that we can prevent it. And a lot of the laws that have been offered to the legislature have really been, as we heard earlier, kind of circling around the main issue. However, last year the one bill that was passed has really created a collaboration between probation departments and child welfare so that we can stop incarcerating these children and victims of human trafficking and start providing appropriate resources for them so that their healing can begin. We also have a bill before you, which I am sponsoring, that Senator Huff is carrying, that's really a data bill. Because right now we don't have statewide. I have good numbers. Statewide we do not. And this is a data bill that will just break down what the sections are in the commercial sex world so that we know who's an adult who's working and soliciting, who's an adult who's soliciting to purchase sex with an adult worker, and who's soliciting sex with a minor. There's no differentiation in the law right now. And until we start breaking it down by those three categories to start, we won't be able to get good data because we'll be taking out our number 2 pencil and a ledger to try to figure it out. So I'm hoping that legislation moves forward. I think it'll be critical. The last thing I want to say is that through an award I got this year, came with money, and we started the Human Exploitation and Trafficking Institute, HEAT Institute, and we have convened a commission of the top leaders in the state, and we're starting public hearings much like this next week in San Diego. We're in San Diego, LA, Orange County, Fresno, Sacramento, and the Bay Area to try to get exactly what you're doing, is trying to get a full picture, how we're responding as a state, what are the greatest challenges, what are the needs, where are the gaps, and then come together to make evidence-based recommendations to your legislature so that we can move forward with combating human trafficking.
Thank you. You and I will sit down and have a great discussion on the numbers, and I look forward to that. All right, Ms. Dugan. Could you proceed?
Thanks so much. My name is Maxine Dugan. I am an erotic service provider. An erotic service provider is anybody who earns a living from their erotic labor: prostitutes, exotic dancers, adult film performers, phone sex operators, and webcam performers. And I myself work as a prostitute of 25 years, and I pretty much plan on working for another 25 more. Our group is completely unfunded. In a statement published on Wednesday, August 12th in 2015 by journalist Mike Ludwig, he stated that the director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, Bien Ami, said that sex trafficking is a means to end for the commercial sex industry. It is clear from this statement that the intention behind all the sex trafficking legislation is really a de facto means to remove all agency from participants, the agency of the participants in the sex industry. And this is clearly a human rights violation. Anti-trafficking groups use the term abolish, meaning to disappear the sex industry. They justify the use of criminalizing our occupation as an approach, but it really harms our community. Our group opposes anti-trafficking legislation because it relies on the continued criminalization of our labor under the guise of rescuing trafficked victims, and it turns all of our intimate, domestic, and commercial relationships into sex traffickers and pimps, and we find this completely inappropriate. Anti-trafficking legislation is always sold to the public as rescuing children. Last week, law enforcement announced that they had carried out these types of rescuing efforts. What they didn't say in their press releases is that they actually had conducted anti-prostitution sting operations to do so. These prostitution sting operations result in the arrest of both adults and the underage alike. It is unclear who was arrested for prostitution under the guise of rescuing children, who went to jail, who has become a defendant in a case that's being adjudicated in criminal courts. We oppose such poor public reporting by law enforcement agencies, but they have been able to get away with it because of the poor, overbroad definitions that conflate prostitution as victims, minors as children, children as prostitutes, and our relationships as pimps and traffickers. It should be unacceptable to this committee that such reporting is allowed to whip up public and political posturing towards a problem that could be easily solved by decriminalization of prostitution. Our group has filed a federal lawsuit against the state of California to invalidate the prostitution law to stop this costly, failed approach, and to force our state to instead treat our community with equal protection under the law. The criminalization of prostitution is big money in our state. It allows law enforcement and state agencies as well as nonprofits to apply for and receive tax dollars under the guise of rescuing children. This is clearly failed policy. I have provided for you declarations from anonymous adult white female sex worker who had been entrapped by a naked FBI agent who posed as a customer in a prostitution sting operation under the guise of rescuing children, while in another instance she performed oral sex on a local California county sheriff. She was arrested in both cases for prostitution. Her story provides some insight to how these law enforcement agencies and their right-along nonprofits rescue people violated her constitutional rights. I'm also providing with you a redacted police report of a 29-year-old black female who, too, was arrested for prostitution under the guise of rescuing children. As you can see from that report I've provided for you, under the modus operandi, the police have listed crimes, sex, and children, but there were no children involved in her arrest. So our concern is that these police reports who are naming children in them when there are no children involved are being logged somehow as sex trafficking, and that in turn those police agencies and those nonprofits are using those inflated numbers to solicit monies to provide for their salaries, apparently. Our main suggestion is to untangle this legislative quagmire with these definitions by creating a new definition that encompasses our whole erotic community, and that would destigmatize erotic service providers. We specifically suggest the enactment of the Obama administration's suggestion that we get some anti-discrimination legislation for our community, so that when we are victims of crime that we can go and report without the threat of being arrested or for prostitution or being investigated as sex traffickers. We also asked the committee to consider removing legal or sexual contact as a legal means to entrap people in prostitution. Because, if they're treating adults in this way, we know they're treating minors in this way, and this is completely dangerous and reckless. We also asked the committee to consider, changing these definitions to be able to enfranchise our community. We feel that's very important, that we are part of the problem, or we are part of the solution to end the problem of force, fraud, and coercion in our industry by being able to separate out those of us who are in the industry by choice as opposed to people who are forced, and that will be a new public treasure for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Now, I know that there are going to be objections to what you said from members of this panel. What I'd like to do for now is say that we're all adults in this room, and we can listen to what Maxine has to say. We can listen to what the other members have to say. I don't want this to get into a back and forth. I've heard that on the radio when Maxine was sitting down with some law enforcement folks. But what I will say is in common between what Maxine talked about and what the DA talked about is that we really have to get better data. And on that, there's a consensus. Because, again, the numbers I'm seeing here are 90 people convicted for sex trafficking, 182 convicted for pimping and pandering, and 61 for pimping and pandering for youth. And yet the numbers we see in terms, we're seeing much larger numbers in other places. So, and the academic community is saying there is no consistent measure, absolutely no consistent measure. Some people are calling any kind of pimping trafficking, whether it's a friend who's helping someone out or whether it's someone who is enslaving someone. So we really need to, I think D.A. O'Malley made a good point, which reinforces what you've had to say, that we really need to divide this up so we can understand and get numbers that make sense across our state. And then perhaps we can get other states to do something similar so we really do understand where this is coming from. It's also important to remember that while we're talking a lot about sex trafficking, that labor trafficking could be a bigger problem. If you just start with wage theft, there are probably hundreds of thousands of people suffering from wage theft in the state. When it gets to the level of trafficking, a common denominator on that is when more than half of the wages are taken. And that's sort of at least on some people, a dividing line, whether it should be half or a quarter or three-quarters, I don't know. But again, these are big problems and that we're going to need to understand them better, and I would just say that the two of you agree on that. And let's not try and argue about the details. But you've also made your point, which we've heard, which is that prostitution being done by adults as you do and as a free choice is different from trafficking, and we've definitely heard that as well. All right. Mr. Mosley, you could give us your 5 or 10 minute opening.
Thank you. I'm Gerald Mosley. I had prepared a statement that was a bit longer than 5 minutes. So
just go ahead. Just go ahead, and if it's 10, it'll be okay. The DOJ report, let me be brief here because some of these issues have already been touched on. The DOJ report was very good, I think, in emphasizing how unreliable these numbers are. What I intend to point out is that the unreliability of the numbers is very often the result of conflating prostitution with trafficking. One of the problems in developing a reasonable estimate is the lack of uniformity in how trafficking is measured. Some analysts, for example, insist that virtually any illegal migration leading to prostitution is trafficking, regardless of the consent or the foreknowledge of the migrant. And perhaps this is the reason the DOJ has seen fit to make explicit in their report that human trafficking and smuggling are fundamentally different crimes. The San Francisco Human Trafficking Report of this year discloses that its police department counted all adult sex workers as suspected traffic survivors, even without signs of force, fraud, or coercion. Perhaps because of this tendency, even the U.S. State Department in its 2010 Trafficking in Persons report states, prostitution by willing adults is not human trafficking, regardless of whether it is legalized, decriminalized, or criminalized. And I urge this committee to look behind any figures that it receives to assess the basis for those figures. Rigorous research into the phenomenon of prostitution paints a markedly different picture than the image of the intimidated and coerced trafficking victim,
and a markedly different picture than popular stereotypes of prostitution. I will mention here only a few of the facts that challenge popular preconceptions, but I will be happy to provide the committee with studies and research that underlie what follows as requested. Only about 20% of prostitutes work on the street. The rest work indoors. Sex workers today make conscious decisions to enter the trade, often viewing it as a part-time job that grants autonomy and flexibility. A significant portion of clients of call girls are regular clients of one call girl, and far from abusive, many clients seek intimacy and some level of emotional connectivity. Most streetwalkers do not, in fact, have pimps. Limited studies found only 6% of streetwalkers in Los Angeles and 7% in Miami shared their income with pimps. Amnesty International recognizes the difference between trafficking and prostitution. In August, its decision-making body reaffirmed its abhorrence of trafficking, but also recommended that nations decriminalize all aspects of consensual sex work. Amnesty is not alone. Other national and international bodies that support decriminalization include Freedom Network USA, and that's an organization of 38 providers of service to victims of trafficking. These are people who are dedicated to helping trafficking victims. Human Rights Watch, the World Health Organization, and the UN-sponsored Global Commission on HIV and the Law. Amnesty recommends a refocusing of laws to tackle acts of exploitation, abuse, and trafficking, rather than having catch-all offenses that criminalize sex workers. Now is the time for California to take a leadership role in just such rethinking and retooling of efforts to both effectively combat trafficking and to respect individual autonomy and constitutional privacy rights. Professor Ronald Weitzer, leading expert on sex work and law enforcement at George Washington University, has pointed out that prostitution policies are becoming increasingly divorced from sound research. Sound research is what confronts us with the harm that criminalization of prostitution does and the benefits that decriminalization can bring. In a criminalized environment, sex workers are isolated. They are afraid to report crimes for fear of their own arrest, and thus can be expected to be afraid to report evidence of trafficking. As to the impoverished and unsophisticated sex worker, who may be the most vulnerable to arrest and the most in need of state assistance, giving her a criminal record that will exacerbate her difficulties in ever entering the legitimate job market is hardly a constructive response to her plight. And of course, all being said, decriminalization of her private exchange of sex for money does not entail turning a blind eye to acts of harassment or nuisance or intimidation occurring on the public streets. Attempts to enhance penalties on customers can be expected to deter only peaceful customers with respectable careers and reputations to lose, leaving sex workers with only the more troublesome and dangerous clients. This is one of the consequences of Sweden's much talked about criminalization of the customer and not the sex worker, at least as concerns women working on the street. The primary effect of the law has been to drive sex work underground where it is riskier. The UN's Global Commission on HIV and the Law released a report in 2012 denouncing the Swedish approach, saying since the enactment in 1999, the law has not improved. Indeed, it has worsened the lives of sex workers. And there's no evidence that Sweden's model has actually decreased trafficking. The criminalization of sex workers does not contribute to the fight against trafficking. And trafficking is coercion and deception of someone into prostitution, or else bringing a minor into prostitution. Law enforcement has the opportunity to question sex workers in their investigations of trafficking, whether or not sex work is illegal. And as noted above, it can be expected that sex workers who see law enforcement as allies and protectors in a decriminalized environment will be much more willing to cooperate with those investigations. Moreover, the contention that the threat of prosecution for prostitution is needed in order to pry information about trafficking out of reluctant sex workers suggests that the criminalization of a population can be justified on the sole ground that it creates a tool for intimidating witnesses into cooperating with law enforcement. The available data from other countries gives very good evidence that decriminalization of sex work does not increase trafficking. In Germany, the number of confirmed trafficking victims has steadily declined since 2002, and that's when Germany decriminalized third-party involvement. Brothel owners, pimps, prostitution was already legal. Prostitution itself was already legal. There is no evidence that legalization of sex work in 3 states in Australia, in the Netherlands, or in New Zealand have increased sex trafficking. Indeed, there is strong international evidence of the positive effects of decriminalizing sex work. Since legalization in the Netherlands, the improvement in relations between law enforcement and sex workers has been described as a sea change. A 2010 study found that legal brothels in Sydney and Melbourne, Australia, fared better on measures of health and safety than the illegal ones in Perth.
Perhaps you could just sum up.
Okay, one last paragraph.
Okay.
New Zealand decriminalized sex work in 2003, and since then sex workers feel safer and they feel more comfortable reporting crimes. They are confident that the police will treat them with respect and take their complaints. Their legal status has improved their working conditions, both on the street and indoors. The empowerment of sex workers is best illustrated by a New Zealand sex worker who last year sued her brothel owner for sexual harassment. She prevailed. She got money damages. With this background, California now has the opportunity to, in the words of the governor's recent veto message, pause and reflect how our system of criminal justice can be made more human, more just, more cost-effective.
Okay, thank you. I would like to see more of the details of that. Again, if we could sit down perhaps with my staff and get the particulars. The only verifiable number you mentioned was in Germany, where the number of trafficked victims, at least in terms of prosecutions, went down. We would need to look into whether they went down because people aren't finding them or whether they went down because they're in fact less. So there's a lot of questions there, and then you mentioned conditions being better, et cetera. And again, I'd like to get the specifics. I do think, although I laughed a bit, that it is perfectly appropriate for a woman who is working in a brothel to sue the owner for sexual harassment. I mean, I did giggle, but frankly, I can understand it, you know? So those are all important. Senator Huff asked a question which I'd like to bring to you. His concern is that decriminalization could lead to more sex with children because there would be more open sex. You could have a 16 or a 17-year-old, for example, who looked much older, working in a brothel, working somewhere else, working even independently, and someone would just simply not know that they were underage. So what is your do you have a response to Senator Huff's question?